A century ago, America sent its furnaces to Russia. Half a century later, Russia sent its rockets to space. Both were born from the same faith that mastery over matter could justify anything. Magnitogorsk was not just a factory, it was the birthplace of that faith made real, a physical testament to mankind's refusal to stay still. And perhaps that's what Stalin saw when he touched that Detroit-made railing and whispered, "This will do." He wasn't admiring ideology, he was acknowledging inevitability. Because the moment man learned to shape iron, he stopped believing in destiny and started manufacturing it instead. If you stand on the hill overlooking Magnitogorsk tonight, you'll see the glow still rising from the valley, a soft orange pulse, like a century-old heartbeat that refuses to die. The workers change, the governments change, but the rhythm stays the same. You can almost hear it say, in a voice made of wind and fire, "I was built by enemies. I served tyrants and dreamers alike, and I remain because precision needs no ideology." Across oceans, in libraries and archives, you can still find the letters written by those first American engineers, the men who shipped Detroit to Siberia. They wrote about cold that cracked wrenches like glass, about nights spent welding under the northern lights, about Russian laborers who refused to stop because failure meant hunger for an entire village. One letter ends with a sentence that feels like prophecy. "We came to build a factory. I think we built a future." He was right, though he couldn't have known that the factory would outlive the country he built it for and the country he came from. Progress rarely asks for permission. It just leaves footprints, sometimes in snow, sometimes in steel. Every generation believes it invented progress, but progress has been burning quietly for centuries, in kilns, in forges, in furnaces like this. Magnitogorsk is one of the few places on Earth where that fire never went out. It saw the birth of socialism, the rise of fascism, the age of the atom, the fall of the wall, and through all of it, the fire kept feeding on oxygen and faith. Faith not in nations, but in process, in the simple belief that a man and a machine working together can make something stronger than both. History loves its ironies. Magnitogorsk was built by men who never trusted each other, capitalists and communists, each convinced they were using the other. But the furnace outlived them all. It outlived capitalism's profits and communism's promises. It became something else entirely, a testament to the fact that progress doesn't need permission to collaborate. The American bolts, the Soviet ore, the hands that fed the fire, they were all part of the same equation. Steel was simply the answer. In a Moscow museum, there's a small plaque beside a black and white photograph of the first workers at Magnitogorsk. The caption reads, "Builders of Socialism, 1932. But in the corner of the frame, you can just make out a man in a cap, his face half hidden, his jacket with a patch that reads Bethlehem Steel. They cropped him out in later prints. But there he remains, the ghost of collaboration captured by accident, standing at the edge of a new world, watching a fire he helped create consume everything that came before." There's something humbling about steel. It's simple in its chemistry, but infinite in its expression. It is strength only through submission, or purified by destruction. It doesn't argue. It endures. Perhaps that's why dictators love it, and democracies depend on it. Because steel is the one language that power and freedom both understand. You cannot lie to steel. It will expose your weakness the moment you stop respecting its process. That is why Magnitogorsk lasted, because both sides, in their own way, respected the process, even when they hated each other. If you stand near the old knoll, one furnace today, you can still feel the hum under your boots. It's the sound of a machine that has never truly cooled. Tour guides point out the relics. The old American compressors still running. The cast iron floor plates stamped Bethlehem. They've been repainted, renamed, but never replaced. You can hear the ghosts of Pittsburgh in the hum of Magnitogorsk, a duet played across a century, the rhythm of progress that neither ideology could silence. And when the molten steel flows into molds, the glow is the same shade of orange it was in 1932. For all our revolutions, heat has never learned politics. The Soviet Union is gone. The corporations that built its bones are gone too. But the steel remains. It built both worlds. It outlasted both creeds. It still moves beneath us, in bridges, in ships, in the skeletons of cities. Every beam that carries weight today is a descendant of that first transatlantic gamble, the day ideology bowed to metallurgy. Because there, in that mountain at the end of the world, men proved something timeless. You can command armies, you can silence nations, but you cannot fake craftsmanship. Steel doesn't care who gives the order. It only cares who understands the heat dot. Steel remembers. It does not keep names, or flags or borders. It keeps only pressure, the weight of the hands that built it, the rhythm of the machines that shaped it, the heat that made it obedient. Magnitogorsk remembers. The steel there has seen empires rise and collapse, slogans shouted and forgotten, leaders buried, statues melted down, but the furnaces still hum, steady as a pulse beneath the surface of history. What began as an American experiment became a Soviet foundation, and now stands as a monument to both. The fire never chose sides. It simply endured. To walk through Magnitogorsk today is to walk through a century of ambition. The factory sprawls like a city within a city. Kilometers of pipes, towers, smoke, and rails that seem less constructed than grown. You can still smell the iron in the air. You can taste it, metallic and faintly sweet. You can feel the heat bleeding from the furnaces, even in winter when the sun forgets the horizon. The younger workers check digital readouts, but the older ones still listen with their ears. They can tell the temperature by tone, the purity of metal by the sound of the pour. Technology evolves, instinct doesn't. That's what Magnitogorsk became, a cathedral where faith was replaced by repetition, and repetition became something holy. In the mid-1990s, something strange happened. American engineers came back, not as missionaries of capitalism, but as consultants hired to modernize the same furnaces their grandfathers had designed 6 decades earlier. They arrived to find a landscape both alien and familiar, the same catwalks, the same rail lines, the same black snow falling slow and patient, and there stamped into the side of a cooling tower, barely visible through paint and rust, Carnegie Steel, 1930. The inscription was worn but legible, like a signature refusing to fade. One engineer, an old man who'd spent his life at Bethlehem Steel, stood for a long moment, hand on the iron that had outlived his entire company. "We thought we built it for 5 years," he said. "Turns out we built it forever." The Americans came with laptops, the Russians with notebooks. They spoke different languages, but the machines understood both. Together they replaced old relays with digital sensors, steam gauges with monitors, but left the core untouched. Because at its core, Magnitogorsk was already perfect. Its furnaces were tuned not just by mathematics, but by memory, by decades of workers who could hear the difference between efficiency and impatience. They taught the Americans something unexpected, that endurance can be more precise than innovation. As the Cold War archives opened, historians on both sides began to discover the documents, contracts, correspondence, shipping manifests, proof of the partnership neither nation had dared to admit. A century of propaganda had buried the truth, but paper, like steel, has a way of surviving its owners. They found letters from 1931, requests for bolts, for welding wire, for spare turbine parts, all signed in English, all stamped by Soviet trade missions. They found a note in Ford's archive from an anonymous executive. "They will build socialism with our machines, and we will build profit with theirs." Both sides got what they wanted. Neither understood what they had built together. Even now, Magnitogorsk lives on a knife edge between survival and exhaustion. Its people measure their lives in shifts. The sound of slag pouring still drowns conversation. The night sky still glows like a warning that never comes. A visitor once said that Magnitogorsk looked like a city permanently on fire, but the locals call it light. Because in a land where winter lasts half the year, fire is not destruction, it's proof of life. One steel worker put it simply, "We don't make steel here. We make tomorrow." In the 1970s, Magnitogorsk was a city of 500,000 souls. Every life orbited around the factory. Shift sirens replaced church bells. Smoke marked the hours more precisely than clocks. Men were born, worked, and buried within sight of the furnaces. Generations inherited not property, but heat. They learned that steel had moods, that you could hear when it was ready to pour, that molten metal hisses differently when it's pure. They spoke to the furnaces like family, and in a way they were. For all its scale and ideology, the city had become a conversation between man and machine, a dialogue of endurance. The Soviets called it industrial harmony. The Americans might have called it flow, but the truth was simpler. It was survival turned into craft. In 1978, an American metallurgist visiting as part of a rare exchange program stood inside the main hall of the Magnitogorsk plant. He traced his hand across a steel beam and saw faint embossed letters under the paint. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, 1929. He smiled and whispered to his interpreter. "We built this," the interpreter replied. "We kept it working." And in that small exchange, half pride, half irony, lay the story of the century. Two nations, opposite in belief, bound by the same fire. When the Soviet Union began to crumble, Magnitogorsk did not. It was too old, too practiced, too essential. The furnaces had seen 5-year plans come and go, leaders rise and vanish, ideologies renamed, and yet the metal still flowed, indifferent, immortal, exact. The city's skyline looked the same in 1985 as it had in 1935, smokestacks against the sky, orange light leaking from every window, the heartbeat of the factory audible in the bones of its workers. To the people who lived there, history was noise, production was truth. When the Soviet flag came down in 1991, many cities fell silent. Ministries dissolved, salaries disappeared, but the furnaces of Magnitogorsk refused to notice. They did not know the word country. They only understood the language of fuel and feedstock, the grammar of pressure. As long as someone brought ore, they would continue to burn, and so they did. The workers stayed, not out of ideology, but out of rhythm, a rhythm passed down like inheritance. One welder, interviewed years later, said, "When the radio stopped talking about the party, I kept working. The metal doesn't care what the radio says." That was the truth of Magnitogorsk, a place where the machine had become its own government. By the 1950s, Magnitogorsk had become something mythic, a city that made steel for half the continent. Its output built the rails of the Trans-Siberian, the bridges over the Volga, the ship hulls that cracked ice on the northern sea route. It was an empire within an empire, and it didn't belong to ideology anymore. It belonged to rhythm, the rhythm of gears, the hiss of oxygen, the sound of slag falling like rain. It was no longer about who owned the factory. It was about keeping the fire fed. For the workers, the furnace was not a symbol. It was survival. You could not live near fire that long and not believe in it. A Soviet poet once called Magnitogorsk a city that dreams in metal, but metal does not dream. It only obeys heat. In that obedience lay its paradox. The American furnaces built for profit had been reborn in service to the state. The Soviet workers who worshipped ideology now served precision instead. Every nation begins with a dream. Every machine begins with a purpose. But the furnace is older than both. It belongs to anyone who keeps it burning. Decades later, Western metallurgists studying Soviet steel samples found something impossible. Alloys used in bridges, railways, and tanks contained traces of formulas unique to American manufacturing of the 1920s. The balance of manganese, the purity of the carbon, exact matches to U.S. standards, long abandoned elsewhere. The past had refused to die. The American chemistry had survived in Soviet metal, invisible proof of cooperation across an ideological abyss. When one engineer presented the findings at a 1970s conference, a Soviet delegate simply smiled and said, "Steel remembers who taught it, but it never forgets who kept it alive." By the 1960s, Magnitogorsk was no longer just a factory. It was the backbone of the Cold War. Its steel armored the tanks in Hungary, the ships in Cuba, the missiles that reached toward the same stars America was chasing. Each new weapon was built from the same furnaces that had once been assembled by American hands. The irony was total. The two great powers that defined the century were now building rival empires on the same technological DNA. One chased freedom, the other chased control. Both worshipped progress. Both prayed to steel. Every rifle, every artillery shell, every T-34 tank carried the same signature in its metal. Traces of American alloy refined by Soviet perseverance. The same steel that had been shaped in Bethlehem and Chicago now defended Stalingrad and Kursk. The paradox was complete. The weapon of communism was forged by capitalism. The miracle was not ideology. It was metallurgy. When the first T-34 sprawled across the snow, their armor plates bore microscopic remnants of manganese ratios first perfected in American mills. Those ratios made them light enough to move and strong enough to survive. The tanks became legend. The furnaces remained anonymous. But without those furnaces, no legend would have rolled. By 1945, the city of Magnitogorsk had earned its own mythology. The Germans had never reached it. The bombs had never fallen. The fire had never stopped. When victory came, the first telegram of thanks did not go to generals. It went to the plant. Stalin awarded medals not to the workers, but to the machines. He knew the truth. People win battles, machines win wars, and machines obey only one master, heat. When the war ended, the furnaces did not rest. They had become creatures of momentum, too old to stop, too alive to cool. The men who had built them were gone, buried under decades of production. The Americans had returned home, their names deleted from blueprints, their measurements rewritten in Cyrillic. But the steel remembered. Because steel is a kind of memory, it records everything that passes through it. The heat, the pressure, the hands that shaped it. Every girder, every pipe in Magnitogorsk still carried those fingerprints, microscopic evidence of the collaboration both nations tried to forget. In the late 1940s, Soviet textbooks rewrote the origin story. Magnitogorsk became a parable of socialist genius. The word America disappeared. Children learned that Soviet will had created a miracle from frozen ground, that foreign help was a capitalist lie, that the furnaces had been born from the spirit of revolution itself. But even in the silence of propaganda, there were reminders. A steel worker polishing the rails might notice an old serial number cast into the side of a rolling mill. U.S. Steel Company, Pittsburgh, 1931. He would glance around, see the portraits of Stalin and Lenin hanging above him, and quietly scrape the mark away with a file. He wasn't erasing history, he was surviving it. When Stalin spoke of progress, he never mentioned where the blueprints came from. He didn't have to. The evidence was too loud to deny. Every Soviet achievement of the 1930s had an American echo inside it. Not in spirit, but in structure. Every turbine that spun in Danprostro, every press that stamped steel in Gorky, every rail that stretched across the Urals, all of them whispered the same origin story, the same foreign rhythm translated into Russian endurance. It was the strangest alliance in history, a capitalist civilization and a communist one, linked by pressure, precision, and pride, enemies in ideology, partners in production. Yet for all the triumph, the shadow grew. The purges began. The men who had directed Magnitogorsk rise, managers, foremen, engineers, were suddenly suspect. Some vanished into the gulag. Others were replaced by those who knew how to obey faster than they could understand. And yet the furnaces did not falter. They didn't need permission to burn. They were built too well for that. It is one of the great paradoxes of industrial history. Machines designed in freedom outlived the freedom of the men who made them. By 1939, the Soviet Union had become a fortress disguised as a factory. Magnitogorsk's steel fed the Red Army's veins. Trucks, tanks, rifles, all born from the same furnaces that once carried stamps reading Pittsburgh Steel Company. The first 5-year plan had promised industrial self-sufficiency. The second had delivered weapons. Now, whether the world was ready or not, the Soviet Union was ready for war. And when war came, it found the furnaces waiting. When Hitler invaded, he aimed for Moscow, for Leningrad, for Kiev, but not for Magnitogorsk. He couldn't. It lay too far east, behind rivers, behind mountains, behind distances that broke even the most disciplined army. When the front collapsed, factories from the west were torn from their foundations, loaded onto trains, and shipped east. Magnitogorsk received them like organs transplanted into an already burning body. It became the heart of a moving nation, pumping steel to the veins of survival. Women operated cranes. Children hauled slag. Old men stoked furnaces with hands that shook from exhaustion, not age. The furnaces never went out. They couldn't. Stalin distrusted everything he did not command, but he respected craft. When the American crews had warned that concrete in Siberian cold would lie, he had waved them off through proxies. The concrete lied. The Americans fixed it quietly, and the fix worked. It is one of the strangest truths of the century. A dictator who worshipped control was saved repeatedly by the humility of engineers. He took the credit. The machines took the load. The workers took the risk. The steel took the heat. Everyone else took notes. The 1930s turned the Soviet Union into an anvil, and Magnitogorsk was its hammer. The furnaces no longer slept. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a rhythm that no one had written, but everyone obeyed. Order from the mountains, coal from the Kuznetsk basin, steam from the Urals. All converged into motion, a choreography of necessity. Steel poured by day and night, feeding railways that reached east into nothingness, shipyards that rose from frozen rivers, tractors that bit into the same soil where famine had once grown faster than wheat. The Soviet Union was learning the logic of the assembly line, not the American dream of abundance, but the Soviet version of survival. It didn't matter how it started. What mattered was that it moved. Visitors from Moscow wrote reports with reverence bordering on fear. Magnitogorsk, they said, glows like a city that has learned to breathe fire, and it had. Every shift was a sermon to precision. Every worker, a disciple of endurance. The Americans had left behind something subtler than machines, habits. They had taught men how to listen for the change in pitch when molten metal is ready to pour, how to feel temperature, not with thermometers, but with the skin on your cheek, how to trust measurement over orders. Those lessons took root, quietly, even in a system that worshipped obedience. A new kind of faith was being born, faith in method, faith in the machine. By 1936, Magnitogorsk was producing millions of tons of steel each year, enough to lace the continent with rails and frame the skeleton of new cities. Kolyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Norilsk. The Soviets called it the Great Industrial Leap. The truth was more humble and more human. It was not a leap. It was a crawl through cold, through hunger, through discipline, so harsh it became identity, but it worked. In less than a decade, a nation of wooden plows had become a nation of furnaces, and the beating heart of that transformation was the factory that had arrived by ship from across the sea. By the summer of 1932, pillars rose out of snow, furnace shells, stoves, uptakes, cast houses, cathedrals in brick and rivet. The first tap drew a crowd that knew better than to cheer near molten metal, and cheered anyway. A red river cut across the foundry floor into pigs that smoked in the cold like exhausted horses. Stalin read the telegram that night. First iron poured at Magnitogorsk. Comrade, the plan lives. He didn't underline American furnace linings, American tuyas, American blowers. He underlined plan. When he toured the plant months later, he ran a gloved hand along an American-made railing warmed by Soviet heat, looked into the incandescent throat of the furnace, and said the only sentence steel respects: this will do. Engineers call it acceptance. Politicians call it progress. Steel calls it temperature. Steel is the one truth politics can't edit. It obeys heat, pressure, and time, and nothing else. Contracts ended. The Americans drifted home. Some stayed, married endurance, and disappeared into paperwork that didn't survive the next purge. Their names left the placards. Their measurements stayed in the mortar. The plant multiplied. Ore moved in conveyors that thrummed like low hymns. Coke ovens burned day-long midnights. Rolling mills taught red slabs to become rails, plates, beams. Verbs turned to nouns at 30 feet per second. From this city of smoke came the skeleton of a nation, bridges for rivers that froze like iron, hulls for icebreakers that obliged winter to move, armor plates that would one day answer fire with angles. When people spoke of socialist industry, they were often speaking unknowingly of American tolerances. Magnitogorsk did not mind. It had been built to endure the difference between truth and credit. No one builds a blast furnace cheaply. Magnitogorsk paid in the currencies of the living, hands crushed under mill rolls, lungs blackened by dust, sleep reduced to minutes on warm pipes, accidents whose reports used passive voice because active would require names. Yet the furnaces stayed lit. In winter, when the air punished breathing, men worked without scarves because cloth ignites faster than courage. In summer, they sweated water and replaced it with tea and salt. Their reward was motion, metal in, metal out, the one proof that their effort threaded the nation to itself. One night, a worker scratched a sentence into the soot-soft brick behind a stanchion. "We don't build steel, we build chance." He meant that every beam promised a bridge, every plate implied a ship, every rail insinuated a train arriving before starvation did. The deal was simple and obscene. Gold would change hands, so would grain. Hard won and harder taken. In return, factories, not pieces, not samples, entire factories. From Ford, the patterns and pulse of an automobile plant for Gorky. From Caterpillar, heavy equipment with teeth to bite stone. From General Electric, turbines and switchgear. The alphabet of electricity. From U.S. Steel and Bethlehem and Carnegie. The bones of blast furnaces, rolling mills, coking batteries, organs for an industrial body not yet alive. Each part was numbered, wrapped, crated, as if an American city had agreed to be disassembled and mailed. And with the crates came men, engineers, foremen, riggers, welders, a diaspora of competence. They boarded ships in wool coats and optimism, carrying slide rules, pipe tobacco, and a private creed older than nations. If it's built right, it works. When they arrived, they found not a construction site, but a prelude, frozen ground, tents, and a wind that filed nouns down to verbs. Magnitogorsk was a promise written on a blank page of ice. They would have to write the city before they could read the factory. Magnitogorsk was designed to be a cathedral of motion in a land that had perfected stillness, a utopia forged by hunger and exile, a settlement of engineers and prisoners, dreamers and men who had run out of places to run. The Americans brought machines that spoke in thousandths of an inch. The Soviets brought labor that measured endurance in winters survived. Between them, interpreters learning to translate talk, clearance, and tolerance into a language where words bent toward obedience. They welded under aurora light. They erected cranes with fingers split by cold. They measured twice, cut once, and then cut again when the cold changed the math. They improvised with an elegance that had no time to admire itself. An American wrote home, "We build steel in a place where bread is rarer than iron." A Soviet foreman whispered to a friend in a barrack of rough boards, "If we fail, they will forget our names. If we succeed, they will erase theirs." Both men were right. Progress needed translation, not just from English to Russian, but from certainty to survival. Blueprints arrived in feet and inches. The mountain measured in centimeters and stubbornness. Decimal points became sites of prayer. When the Americans said weld, some crews heard melt. When the Soviets answered done, the Americans learned to test twice. Mistakes were remedy and tuition. Concrete froze too fast and cracked like bad promises. So they rebuilt with new mixes that learned to breathe in sub-zero air. Brick kilns devoured fuel. So they redesigned the draft, borrowed heat from waste gas, and taught the furnaces thrift. Every correction became a note on a blueprint, and every note became a habit. Habits multiplied by men become culture. Magnitogorsk was inventing one. They didn't announce it with banners, no anthems, no speeches, just manifests stamped in black ink and the slow groan of cargo winches. It began with a shipment. Thousands of tons of American steel, forged in the white-hot lungs of Pittsburgh and Chicago, rolled into the bellies of ships under winter stars. Girders stacked like verses of a mechanical psalm. Crates of bearings, turbines, switchgear. Blueprints sealed in oilskin. Tools engraved with English letters that would soon learn to answer in Russian. Their destination sat at the seam between Europe and Asia, where the wind comes sharpened by distance, the Ural Mountains. A name followed the shipments across the Atlantic like a rumor, Magnitogorsk, the magnetic mountain, a place where iron lay so close to the skin of the earth that compasses turned shy. To most Americans, it meant nothing. To Joseph Stalin, it meant a future he intended to drag into the present by force. A mountain made of iron, waiting for the only thing that could shape it, steel. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union lived on the edge of a promise. Villages stitched from timber, roads that melted each spring into confession, factories with more slogans than machines, a revolution of ideas housed in a world of bark and mud. Stalin's 5-year plan didn't negotiate with time. It demanded that the clock surrender. Fields would become furnaces, Peasants would become operators. The nation would be remade in the image of pressure and flame. There was only one problem. The Soviet Union had ambition enough to split stone, but no steel industry to carry it. A modern blast furnace is not a wish. It is precision weaponized against ore. It demands temperature curves, refractory brick that doesn't lose its nerve, gas flow that moves like mathematics. Miss any of that, and heat will right your mistakes in fire. The Soviet Union had workers and will. It did not yet have craft. So the most anti-capitalist state on earth did the most capitalist thing imaginable. It went shopping. They didn't announce it with banners. No anthems, no speeches, just manifests stamped in black ink and the slow groan of cargo winches. It began with a shipment. Thousands of tons of American steel, forged in the white-hot lungs of Pittsburgh and Chicago, rolled into the bellies of ships under winter stars. Girders stacked like verses of a mechanical psalm. Crates of bearings, turbines, switchgear. Blueprints sealed in oilskin. Tools engraved with English letters that would soon learn to answer in Russian. Their destination sat at the seam between Europe and Asia, where the wind comes sharpened by distance, the Ural Mountains. A name followed the shipments across the Atlantic like a rumor, Magnitogorsk, the magnetic mountain, a place where iron lay so close to the skin of the earth that compasses turned shy. To most Americans it meant nothing. To Joseph Stalin it meant a future he intended to drag into the present by force. A mountain made of iron, waiting for the only thing that could shape it, steel,